Civil War is often told through the stories of soldiers, but what about those left behind? For civilians in the South, war meant fear, hunger, and destruction. Women took on new roles, families struggled to survive, and entire towns were burned to the ground. How did they end up? This is a story of life on the Confederate home front. When the Civil War began in 1861, many Southerners thought it would end quickly, but as it dragged on, everyday life changed. The North had factories and railroads, but the South relied on farming. With men gone, farms were abandoned and food became scarce. The Union blocked southern ports, stopping supplies. The Confederate government struggled, leading to food shortages and riots. Peaceful towns became battlegrounds and civilians had to adapt. Families stretched to what little they had. Women took over farms and businesses and cared for soldiers. By 1865, Southern life was forever changed. The Southern economy relied on farming, but when the Union blockaded ports, trade stopped and money lost its value. Prices skyrocketed, and families could barely afford basic necessities. A Richmond woman describes, "A barrel of flour costs $250, a pound of bacon $10. Money is useless now. We trade in gold if we can find it." Hunger became unbearable. By 1863, many families in the South had little to eat. In Richmond, a group of starving women led by Mary Jackson marched to the city, breaking into shops and demanding bread. This became known as the Richmond Bread Riots. With men at war, women had to take over. They ran farms, managed businesses, and worked in hospitals. Mary Chestnut, a Confederate woman, explains, "We are widowed by this war. Whether our husbands live or not, every woman in the South now needs her home." Hospitals were filled with wounded soldiers. Nurse Fanny Ricketts described the conditions. Downstairs, there are some 40 men in various stages of death or possible recovery. Blood runs on the floor. The smell is dreadful, but no language can describe it. At home, civilians faced destruction. As Union General William T. Sherman's army moved through the South, farms and cities were destroyed. Mrs. Agnes Law, a civilian in Columbia, South Carolina, recalled, "They took our food, our animals, everything. Then, when nothing was left, they burned the house. We stood outside, watching it turn to ash. Thousands of families became refugees, fleeing with only what they could carry. Some sought shelter with relatives, while others had nowhere to go." Mrs. Green, a Southern woman interviewed in 1939, shared how her family survived. She was just a child when the war began, but remembered the struggles. "After my father died of typhoid, my mother had to care for all 6 of us. We spun our own cotton, made our clothes, and even boiled dirt for salt. When there was no flour, we ground corn into meal and baked it into bread." Like many others, Mrs. Green's family relied on self-sufficiency. Hunger and uncertainty were a daily struggle. At first, Southerners believed in their cause, but as the war dragged on, many lost hope. The Confederate government forced young boys and older men into the army. A woman from Georgia wrote to her husband that the government also took supplies from civilians. Farmers lost their crops and stores had their goods confiscated. Even soldiers deserted, leaving the army to protect their starving families. By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. When Union troops captured Richmond, fires raged through the city as officials fled. The war had taken everything: homes, food, and loved ones. For Confederate civilians, the Civil War was not just a battle between the North and the South. It was a fight for survival. They endured hunger, destruction, and loss. When the war ended, the South was in ruins, but people like Mrs. Green and her family found ways to rebuild. Wars are fought on battlefields, but their scars remain on those left behind. The Civil War reshaped lives, tore apart families, and left the South struggling to rebuild. Yet, through hunger, loss, and destruction, people lived. They had no choice.
Military occupation and/or acute shortages. Southern civilians suffered unimaginable challenges during the American Civil War. This video aims to investigate the strategies adopted by Southern civilians to manage the hardships of this period. By engaging with the various strategies used by regular individuals during the period, we aim to explain how people and communities react to conflict and shortage. This is important as it helps light up the resilience of communities.
The Civil War brought extraordinary hardships for Southern civilians. This included military, occupation, property destruction, and food shortages. This got even worse because of lots of fighting, the Union's naval blockade, and the Confederacy focusing on military needs first.
As you see in this picture, it shows a family forced to leave their home during the Civil War. A horse-drawn cart loaded with furniture and personal items serves as the main point, signifying their departure and the small number of belongings they could transport. This wagon is surrounded by family members whose body language and facial expressions convey the torture and uncertainty of leaving behind their home and means of support. This picture shows how the war forced countless people to leave their homes as armies advanced, destruction spread, or territories were occupied. It captures the courage of civilians searching for safety amid chaos and highlights the resilience despite great hardship. The image powerfully reminds us of the human cost of war, showing how deeply ordinary lives are affected by conflicts. I'll go and join in the bloody strife till this cruel war is over. This photograph depicts the destructive effects of the American Civil War on Southern civilian life. George N. Barnard photographed the one-grand picnic mansion in 1865, located in Charleston, which belonged to one of the founding fathers known as Charles Painke. The location holds significance as the city played a significant role in the war. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. The picture reveals the house incompleted with brick walls and empty window frames. The mansion's ruined interior and collapsed roof are clearly visible, showing the severity of the disasters. Broken pieces and rubble cover the ground around the ruins, showing just how badly the house was. This picture powerfully reminds us of how the war affected not just the buildings, but also the lives of people who lived there. Homes, businesses, and important landmarks were destroyed, leaving families without shelter and communities in ruins. It also makes you think about how difficult it must have been for people to rebuild their life after so much loss. They had to find ways to fix their home, reopen businesses, and bring their neighborhood back to life. This image helps us understand the big challenges they faced and the strength they needed to start over. It shows how the impact of war goes beyond the battlefield, affecting everyday people and their life. War brought severe hardships to Southern civilians, whether it's destruction, military occupation, and shortages. The Union's naval blockade and the Confederate focus on military needs made things even worse. Many families were forced to flee their homes, carrying only a few belongings with them in horse-drawn carts. This displacement caused widespread suffering as people sought to refuge from hard forces, destruction, and occupations. The war also devastated Southern architecture, as shown in a photo of the Pinckney Mansion, Charleston, South Carolina, taken by George N. Barnard in 1865. Through these images, we see the resilience and the capability of a community that faced unhuman challenges.
The Civil War ended in 1865. Enslaved people were free, but the South was broken. Farms were burned, cities were ruined, and people had to start over. The South had to change, but how did the people live through it? This is the story of how life changed after war. Before the war, the South depended on slaves for work. When slavery ended, the rich plantation owners lost money. Many freed people had no land, no jobs, and no way to start fresh. The economy had to change. Some landowners started sharecropping, a system where freed people worked for little pay. A freedman, Henry Adams, said, "We were free, but we had no land. We worked, but we stayed poor." Many freed people hoped to own land, but the government did not keep this promise of giving them land. Instead, most had to rent land from white landowners, keeping them in poverty. Poor white Southerners also suffered. Many lost farms and had no money. They had no compete for work in a new system. City workers and shop owners also struggled. A Southern woman, Sarah Dewinson, wrote, "We have nothing left but hope, and even this is slipping away." Some moved to cities in search of jobs, only to find overcrowding and few opportunities. Others became sharecroppers, trapped in debt like freed people. The government created the Freedmen's Resisted Change. They passed black codes, laws that limited the rights of freedmen. These laws controlled where black people could live, work, and travel. Some states even forced black people to work for white employees or face arrest. Former Confederate soldiers also struggled. Many returned home to find their farms in ruins and their families in poverty. Without slavery, plantations had to find new ways to operate. Some tried hiring workers while others relied on sharecropping, but the South economy was too slow to recover. Many white Southerners felt bitter about losing the war. They blamed the North and freed people for their struggles. This anger led to violence group Geek the Klub. Despite hardships, some progress was made. By 1870, black men could vote and hold office. Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. senator and make black legislators served in the state government, but not everyone accepted these changes. Many white Southerners were angry. Groups like Ku Klux used violence to scare free people. A report from 1871 says the black families were attacked for trying to vote their own land. The Klan burned schools and churches to keep black people from gaining power. Despite the federal laws trying to stop them, violence against freedmen continued. The U.S. government tried to stop the violence. President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Enforcement Acts giving federal troops power to fight for the HG Klan. For a time, their efforts helped protect black rights, but after Reconstruction ended in 1877, the federal government stopped protecting freed people and many rights were taken away. Southern stopped protecting freed people. Southern states passed GLM clubs enforcing segregation and making it hard for black people to vote. The end of Civil War changed the South forever. Some people built new lives while others tried to keep things the same. Reconstruction was about more than rebuilding, it was about creating a new society. The struggle for equality was far from over. The South moved forward, but many challenges remained. The fight for justice and civil rights were continued for generations.